Good morning and welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue now our reading and discussion of the book The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, one of the most important books in my library. I hope my listeners appreciate this book and the information that you gain. Yesterday, we were talking about the reign of Pope Pius X, this strong-willed pope who tried to impose his supreme spiritual and, most importantly, his temporal authority over the Roman Catholic Church of France. And the Roman Catholics of France rebelled against him and passed what was called the Pragmatic Sanction. And that was to protect the Roman Catholic Church in France from the papal authority. It says each of the parties to this arrangement supposed himself. I'll back up just a little bit further. And by the way, those who are following along in the book, we're on page 664, about the middle of the page. It says a diplomatic ambassador was sent to Rome and finally came to a compromise with Pope Leo X by abrogating the Pragmatic Sanction and substituting the celebrated Concordat of Bologna in its place. So, upon the death of French King Louis XII, Francis I came to power in France, and he sold out the Roman Catholics of France. And he went to Rome, sent an ambassador to Rome to work out a compromise with this usurpacious Pope Leo X, and they just arbitrarily set aside the Pragmatic Sanction without consulting the people. They had no consideration, as is always the case, for the people. When the church and the state, when the Roman Catholic Church and the state become united, the people are a non-factor. And what happens then, as always throughout this book, the divine writers, that is the king and the pope together, who share the divine right according to their philosophy of rulership, get together and support one another's divine right by just arbitrarily making laws and bringing the people into subjection. And this is the case of this instance in France. They got together, a diplomatic ambassador was sent to Rome, and finally came to a compromise with Pope Leo X by abrogating the Pragmatic Sanction and substituting the celebrated Concordat of Bologna in its place. Okay, a Concordat is a binding agreement between a nation's government and the papacy, and it usually contains restrictions and limitations, making Roman Catholicism the official religion of the nation, authorizes the Pope to exact taxes from the church, and makes the church a state-sponsored church. In other words, it exists on the taxes of the people. And so the Pragmatic Sanction is set aside, and the Concordat has replaced it. Now, each of the parties to this arrangement, the Pope and the King, supposed himself the gainer. The King, by being made the head of the Church of France, and the Pope by enabling to collect annats and imposts in France, which had been denied by the Pragmatic Sanction. So here you see the common elements of a Concordat being revealed right here. The King, by concession of the Pope, has allowed the King to become the head of the church, and obviously we must understand that he rules the church at the behest of the Pope, and also granting that the Pope is able to collect taxes from France. Now, this is in violation of the pragmatic sanction. So you see the purpose of destroying this protective measure called the pragmatic sanction. Now it says the Pope exchanged a share of his spiritual right claimed by his predecessors for this temporal advantage. In other words, tax collection. And it says, but France was not as easily reconciled as the king. So you can see the people are rising up in protest. And it says the Parliament resisted the Concordat, the Parliament being the representative of the people in the government. The people resisted the Concordat and adhered to the pragmatic sanction. The University of Paris did the same. An appeal to a general council was insisted on, that at Rome not being so considered. So there was a general council being already held in Rome, which the French didn't acknowledge as valid. Remember, it was a papal council in rebellion against the ecumenical council, which asserted its authority over the Pope. So the Pope just called his own council, held it in Rome, held it in Italy, where he would be more protected and his rights and prerogatives would be assented to more easily. And says the king, becoming incensed at this resistance to his royal will, denounced these proceedings as seditious and undertook to enforce the Concordat by despotic power. Despotic power. He's working under the authority of the Pope. This king is ruling by despotic power. That's a defining characteristic of a government that is under papal influence. It exercises despotic power. And when there becomes such time, and I assert that we are already in such a time, that our government is under papal authority, that we will see exercised in this country despotic power, and it comes by the form of presidential directives and other such like things, like the Patriot Act and the NDAA and other authoritarian laws passed by fiat, by simple decree, by our presidents, and just silently acquiesced to by the people and by Congress. Despotic power is being seen right here in America. And the first thing we must suspect is the papacy has gotten authority over at least the White House, and I assert also the Supreme Court and the Parliament, Congress. Okay. Now, in the meantime, the period fixed for the 11th session of the Lateran Council had arrived, and the session was held without the attendance of any French clergy. Now, even the French clergy are protesting this council, and said nothing had transpired to give it universality, inasmuch as many parts of the Christian world yet remained unrepresented in it. It still retained its original Italian character and was, to all intents and purposes, the Pope's council and not that of the Church. And yet it was at this 11th session of the council that a decree was passed which it is now claimed recognizes the Pope's infallibility. The foregoing facts show, if such a decree was passed, that it was not binding on the Church as a part of its faith, and the fact that it was not so considered by the Church is fully established by subsequent events. But no such decree was, in point of fact, passed by the Fifth Lateran Council. The facts are these. The Pope issued a bull abrogating the pragmatic sanction, affirming the Concordat, and declaring that he had authority above councils and full power to call, remove, or dissolve them at will. He also renewed the bull of Pope Boniface VIII called Unum Sanctum, which asserted the supremacy of the Pope over the world, both in spirituals and in temporals. When this bull was read in the council, it was, quote, approved by all the bishops, unquote, except one, says Dupin. There was no freedom either of discussion or of will. It was simply a strong man, as Leo X was, commanding and exacting obedience by the superiority of his own will. There was no decree about it, nothing but the simple approval of the Pope's bull. And consequently, this is to be taken merely as the assent to it by those prelates who were present, which was in no way binding upon those who were not present. The council, as such, was not represented in the church, as such, was not represented in the council, and consequently did not assent to its action, whatever it may have been. The French Christians resisted the whole thing, continued to adhere to the pragmatic sanction, and to resist the Concordat. And therefore, the defenders of the Pope's infallibility cannot, with any propriety whatever, insist that the Fifth Lateran Council made it a part of the law of the Church. What was done by the Ecumenical Council of Trent upon this subject, now we're moving from this council to the Council of Trent, considered even to this day to be the most important general council held by the Roman Catholic Church. It says, what was done by the Ecumenical Council of Trent upon this subject is more readily disposed of, although this was the most important of all the councils, and its various sessions were held from 1545 to 1563. In its decree for general reformation, it is provided that, quote, they will be obedient to the constitutions of the Pope and of the councils, determining that all constitutions of general councils and of the Apostolic See in favor of ecclesiastical persons and liberty shall be observed by all, unquote. So you can see it had nothing to do with religion. It had nothing to do with the Roman Catholic faith. It had everything to do with power and authority, and what authority the people will assent to. Now, particularly of notice is that the decree is that the people will obey the constitutions of the popes and of the councils. So, papal infallibility is not present in this. Now, it says, in another decree, which was held back until the final session, and was, quote, never mentioned in any congregation, unquote, it was provided that in all the decrees of Reformation made in the council under the three previous popes, quote, the authority of the Apostolic See is accepted and preserved. Accepted being E-X-C-E-P-T-E-D. In other words, the Pope is above the Apostolic See. That is, the authority of the Pope is accepted and preserved. So the Pope sets himself above the council. And it says that this council intended to enlarge the power of the papacy to the utmost extent. There is no sort of doubt. Its final action was mainly controlled by Italian bishops from Rome, the tools of the Pope, and they would listen to nothing that limited his power. The French ambassador present, writing to the king, said, quote, they will give ear to nothing that may hinder the profit and authority of the court of Rome. Besides, the Pope is of so much master of this council that his pensioners, whatsoever the emperor's ambassadors or we do remonstrate unto them, will do but what they list. In other words, they wouldn't listen to anybody. It was a steamroller. And it says, but it will be observed that neither of these decrees asserts the doctrine of the Pope's infallibility. The most they do is assert that the Church is to be governed by the constitutions of the popes and the councils. They do not decide, nor did the Council of Trent at any other time decide, which of the two should prevail when the constitutions of the popes and the canons of the councils come in conflict. The general terms employed embrace all the councils, and as one canon of the Council of Constance declared that the Pope was inferior to a council, and no ecumenical council, as we have seen, has repealed that canon. Therefore, it is included in the decree of the Council of Trent. Besides, it is said that the faith never changes, that it never can change. This being true, the canon of Constance was a part of the faith after that council had adjourned, and must have continued so up unto the Council of Trent, and could not be changed by it. Therefore, the Council of Trent, while it went as far as it dared to go to give supremacy to the Pope, must be considered as denying his infallibility, because they did not affirm it. If they had intended to affirm it, they would have required obedience to him alone, as the late Lateran Council has done, that being the First Lateran Council of 1870, at the time of the writing of this book, and not to him and the canons of the councils conjointly. Requiring the faithful to look to the constitutions of popes and the canons of the councils is almost an express denial of the Pope's infallibility. Yet it is true that the Council of Trent did not expressly place any limitation upon the power of the Pope. It left it as it found it, but somewhat augmented in strength by the failure to place a curb upon it. While it conceded to the Pope the power to interpret its canons, and thereby gave him great control over the faith, yet it did not give him the power to set aside existing canons or to make new ones. Therefore, it stopped short of declaring him infallible. And so Pope Pius IV understood it when, in 1564, he promulgated the Creed, founded upon existing canons, which has been since reproclaimed by Pope Pius IX, and remained as the faith of the Church up until the late Lateran Council. That creed requires that interpretation of the Scriptures to be accepted, which has, quote, the unanimous consent of the Fathers, unquote, and while it enjoins, quote, true obedience to the Roman Pontiff, unquote, it does not concede to him the power to set aside this, quote, unanimous consent, unquote, and substitute his own interpretation for it. That remained for the late council, which has so changed the creed as to require it now to mean that, quote, the true obedience to the Roman Pontiff, unquote, which is now enjoined, is to accept that interpretation of Scripture which he, the Pope, and not the Fathers, shall give. Does not this change the old faith and substitute a new one for it? Now, it is undoubtedly true that those who, by this change of faith, have elevated the Pope above the Fathers and all the great councils of the Church by assigning to him equality with God on earth, have done so because they hope thereby to be able to bring the world back again to that condition in which it was when the popes did exercise the utmost plenitude of power by usurpations they were strong enough to maintain. Every intelligent reader knows what that condition was, but it is nowhere more graphically portrayed in so far as the popes are concerned than by the greatest of Italian historians, who was a personal observer of the passing events just preceding the Council of Trent. After enumerating some of the usurpations by which the popes had obtained their ascendancy over princes and peoples, he says, quote, "Being raised by these steps unto earthly power, they laid aside little by little the cares of souls and of divine precepts, so that setting their affections wholly upon earthly greatness, and using their spiritual authority only as an instrument of their temporal, they seemed rather to be secular princes than priests. After this, their care and business was no more sanctity of life, increase of religion, love, and charity toward their neighbor, but armies and wars against Christians, handling the sacrifices even with bloody hands, but heaping up wealth, but new laws, new arts, new snares to scrape money from all parts. For this end they used their spiritual weapons without respect, and sold things, both sacred and profane, without any shame at all. The popes and the court thus abounding with wealth, there followed pomp, riot, dishonesty, lust, and abominable pleasures, no care of posterity, no thought of maintaining the perpetual dignity of the papacy, but in place thereof succeeded ambitious and pestiferous desires to exalt their sons, nephews, and kindred, not only to immoderate riches, but to principalities and to kingdoms, bestowing their dignities and benefices not upon virtuous and well-deserving men, but either selling them to those who would give the most, or misplacing them upon ambitious, covetous, and impudently voluptuous persons." Unquote. In other words, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And whenever the Pope gains power, the result is corruption in the priesthood. And no more is that more profound than today. Now that concludes chapter 21 of the book. We'll continue now with chapter 22, and I will forego the preliminaries and just get directly to the text in the observance of time here. R.W. Thompson says, "It has abundantly appeared in the preceding chapters that the theory upon which the papal system has been constructed requires all Roman Catholics to be exclusive, intolerant, and aggressive. To say that they are not all so is only to say what everybody knows, but it is no answer to the allegation against the system itself. Those who constitute these commendable and praiseworthy examples are mostly single individuals, but sometimes communities, as is frequently found in the case of the United States. They are, however, generally influenced by their special surroundings and have never acquired sufficient prominence to impress their sentiments upon those who mold the principles and direct the course of the papacy." Okay. R.W. Thompson is talking about the Roman Catholic laity, and most particularly about those silent dissenters within the Roman Catholic Church, sometimes single individuals and sometimes entire communities, especially here in the United States. They just don't have any say in the church. They don't have any say. They just have to silently acquiesce. And though they be silent dissenters, they still stay in the Roman Catholic Church and generally support the Roman Catholic Church. They're interested in the faith of the Catholic Church, but not so much the hierarchy. It says, "They are, however, generally influenced by their special surroundings and have never acquired sufficient prominence to impress their sentiments upon those who mold the principles and direct the course of the papacy. In other words, the papacy is high and mighty, as it were God on earth, and they have no say over the papacy. It says the popes have never been influenced by them in any degree since the papal power reached its culmination, but on the contrary have simply borne with them on account of their general acceptance of the fundamentals of the Roman Catholic faith and their habit of non-resistance. For a number of centuries, the laity had a voice in the election of popes, which of course made those elected or desired to be elected somewhat circumspect in their conduct toward the laity. This did not give the people any direct influence over the faith, but rather indirect, by means of that representative feature in the church constitution which provided for general councils. There was no change in this mode of procedure until the emperors and the kings of France, Spain, and Germany, from political motives only, arrogantly asserted the imperial right to select popes obedient to themselves, and to dispossess such as were not so. And when, after severe and long continued struggles, the popes were enabled to wrench this usurped power from the hands of royalty, they felt themselves under no obligation to restore the ancient authority of the people, because by that time they had become so inoculated with the sentiments of imperialism themselves that they did not consider the people of having any right whatever in matters of so much importance. Insisting that the episcopal order was established by direct appointment of Christ, they claimed for it the power of self-perpetuation, and therefore it became an established principle of the papacy that even when the people aided in the election of a pope, they had no right to assume that he derived any authority from them. From this principle, it was easy for so ambitious and talented a man as Pope Gregory VII, surrounded by the prevailing superstition of the 11th century, to deduce others which have since become necessary to the life of the papacy. Engaged as he was in consolidating a vast spiritual despotism, he was sagacious enough to know that his success would be in proportion to the removal of its power and authority from the people. Therefore, he employed his vigorous mind, not only while the confidential advisor of 4 popes, but more especially after he became pope himself, quote, to render all authority, civil and religious, dependent on the fiat of the Holy See, to place thorns and mitres alike at the papal disposal, and to realize what had long floated dimly before the eyes of preceding pontiffs, an object of desire rather than of hope. The scepter of the universe, swayed by the successor of St. Peter as vicegerent of the Almighty, capital A, unquote. Chiefest among the means of consummating this object was the removal of all popular influence from the election of the Pope, so that the ecclesiastical constitution should provide for a pure theocracy with imperial powers. This he accomplished by vesting it exclusively in the College of Cardinals, designated and appointed by the Pope, by compelling all prelates and laymen to bind themselves under the most solemn obligations to the See of Rome, and visiting them with curses, anathemas, and excommunications in the event of their disobedience. So powerful was the influence he exercised upon his age, and so indelibly did he impress his principles upon the constitution of the papacy, that those of his successors who have imitated his usurpations have sheltered themselves behind his great name. And this has been done so frequently with the apparent acquiescence of the laity that at last what was originally the conception of overweening ambition has come to be considered as the infallible teaching of God, as an essential part of his eternal truth. If some of these successors did impair the strength of the system he had constructed by vices which outraged the Christian sentiment of the world, the present Pope, by his exemplary life and piety, has been enabled in some measure to win back those losses. He has at times done so to the extent of being enabled to turn all his papal artillery upon the liberalizing and tolerant opinions of the 19th century and of finding multitudes of followers who agree with him in the pretense that Hildebrand, no less than himself, was the infallible representative of Christ on earth. We must no longer look then to the laity of the Roman Catholic Church for its faith or discipline. They have nothing to do with either, except to obey whatsoever is prescribed to them. And this obedience is required to be so comprehensive and unlimited as to include all that has been in the past, now as in the present, and may hereafter be in the future. Their whole duty is involved in the simple act of submission. Submission. I want to stop here and make a comment. We're talking about Roman Catholicism here, not Islam. Now, the current mantra in the press and the alternative media and even many, many churches is that Islam means submission. And all the world is focused on uniting Christianity, more correctly, to unite all the Protestant churches back under the authority of the Pope, to solidify Christianity and to have one spokesman for Christianity and for Christ, that is the Pope. And what does he require? Submission. And they want this unity in the so-called Christian world so that they can stand up against Islam, which also means submission. Now, in my discussions on amateur radio about Roman Catholicism and about the teachings of the popes and about their usurpations and abominable history and about the bloody inquisitions, and the truth of history reveals that the Roman Catholic Church is the most bloodthirsty organization that ever drew a breath on this planet. That when it comes to bloodshed and tyranny and submission, unquestioning submission, Islam doesn't hold a candle to it. When I talk about the Roman Catholic Church's history on amateur radio, people always ask the question, but what about Islam? What about Islam? Why don't you ever talk about Islam? Well, Islam is worthy of discussion, but everybody else is talking about Islam. Nobody's talking about the Roman Catholic Church. But R.W. Thompson saw the threat that Roman Catholicism was to this Protestant constitutional republic. And I choose to go with history, and I choose to go with the scriptures. And Islam isn't even a factor. So we'll let the mainstream and the alternative medias raise up all the hype about Islam, but the mother of Islam is the Roman Catholic Church. They got their brutality and intolerance and oppressive behavior from their mother. Now, continuing, it says, the whole duty is involved in the simple act of submission. Consequently, if there are here and there some of them, or even many, who are liberal and tolerant, and therefore not aggressive, they either hush up these sentiments in their own breasts, or, if they express them, have not authority sufficient to make them felt, even if known, at Rome. The papacy is reached only through its hierarchy, and they are sworn to obey the Pope implicitly, and to preserve and extend his royalties. He imparts a portion of his infallibility to them in the execution of their theocratic functions, and through them to the laity in the single act of obedience. The strength of the papacy is by these means left unimpaired, and insofar as the claim of universal supremacy is concerned, it is set forth as boldly and defiantly as when Gregory VII hurled his thunders of excommunication and anathema at the head of the German emperor. What government has ever existed which has recognized freedom of religious belief and worship while submissive to the authority of the papacy? In all history there is no account of any such. Wheresoever it has been done, the popes have considered it an act of disobedience to them and dealt with it accordingly. In all the forms of bulls and briefs, they have condemned and denounced it as heresy. Pope Pius IX has done so in his syllabus and other official papers. He's talking about Pope Pius IX, who was then Pope at the time of the writing of this book, and he, like all his predecessors, have condemned individualities and republics and governments that do not submit to the authority, the infallible authority of the popes. All this condemnation of the American government and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and our entire political system of this country is written in the syllabus of error of 1864, and that's what R.W. Thompson is referring to here. He says, Pope Pius IX has done so in his syllabus and other official papers. When the Austrian government in 1855 abolished the Concordat, allowing liberty of all opinions, liberty of the press, liberty of faith, and liberty of instruction in the schools, he characterized the act as inimical to the Church, as, quote, in flagrant contradiction with the doctrines of the Catholic religion, unquote, and by virtue of power which he claimed to have derived directly from Christ, he declared all the acts and decrees in that respect, quote, null and powerless in themselves and in their effect, both as regards the present and the future, unquote. And he threatened all engaged in their execution with the censures of the Church and with excommunication. These threats have been executed by the proclamation of excommunication in 1869 of all heretics, quote, whatever their name and to what sect soever belonging, and those who believe in them and their receivers, promoters, and defenders, unquote, so that the pontifical curse is now resting upon all the institutions of Protestantism and upon all liberal and tolerant opinions, wheresoever they are to be found in the world. When, therefore, we talk about what the Church of Rome teaches and allows in reference to freedom of religion, of the press, and of speech, such as is secured by the Constitution of the United States, we must look not to what is done and said by exceptional individuals or even by communities of liberal tendencies, but to the Pope alone. He is the Church, and absorbs in himself whatsoever power it possesses, in all its height, depth, length and breadth. The pen of inspiration has instructed us that, quote, God is not a man, unquote. But the Pope tells us that he, of all the earth, possesses the attributes of God and must therefore prescribe the faith, reward the faithful, and punish the disobedient. There are two memorable events in history which are sometimes referred to by defenders of the papacy to show that such accusations as the foregoing are unjust and unmerited. For instance, the granting of Magna Carta and the instruction of religious liberty into the colony of Maryland. If this defense were designed only to show that there had been, and yet existed, numbers of Roman Catholics who approved the principles involved in these great measures, it would be perfectly legitimate, and nobody could object, for that is an undoubted fact. But it is not so limited. On the other hand, it is placed to the credit of the papacy, which is not in any sense entitled to it. As to Magna Carta, we have seen that the barons of England incurred the displeasure of Pope Innocent III for extorting it from King John, and that he excommunicated them for doing so, and that he released the king from his sworn obligation to observe it, as he also did several of his successors. We have seen, too, the direct conflict between the principles it expressed and those which pertain to the papal system. The other inquiry, whether the papacy is entitled to any credit for religious toleration in Maryland, comes more directly home to the people of the United States, which makes the investigation of it more immediate concern to us. Now we're going to talk about the early history of the Maryland colony. First of all, you'll notice my pronunciation of Maryland. Most people call it Maryland. I call it Maryland. It was the Roman Catholic colony. It was named after the Virgin Mary, and although it espoused religious liberty, it did it on terms of expediency. And as I've described so many times on the program, even during the reading and discussion of this book, it was expedient that the Pope stay out of the colonies and out of interference with the Roman Catholic government of Maryland, so as to preserve Roman Catholicism, because the overwhelming majority Protestants in this country were ready to obliterate Roman Catholicism. Maryland was under a grave threat that if it did not watch its P's and Q's, if it tried to impose papal tyranny in the colony of Maryland, the Protestants would have wiped them out. They were sick and tired of the persecutions of the papacy, the tyrannies of the papacy, and they would not permit papal tyranny to be planted here in the colonies. Okay, with that said, we'll continue. It says the colony of Virginia was settled under several royal charters. That which erected it into a, quote, corporation and body politic, unquote, was dated May 23, 1609, and was granted by King James I. The district of country included within the colonial limits extended, quote, from sea to sea, west and northwest, unquote, and included all of what afterward became the colony and is now the state of Maryland. Okay, so the colony that we know today as Maryland, the Maryland colony, and now the state of Maryland, was originally part of Virginia. And let me just tell you, Virginia was a Protestant colony. And it says, one of the purposes expressed in this charter was, quote, the conversion and reduction of the people in those parts unto the true worship of God and Christian religion, unquote. And inasmuch as the true worship was at that time in England considered to be that provided by the established church in opposition to that of Rome, King John further said, quote, we should be loath that any person should be permitted to pass that we suspected to affect the superstitions of the Church of Rome, unquote. It required also that the English oath of supremacy should be taken by all the colonists. By these provisions of the charter, therefore, Roman Catholics were positively prohibited from settling in any part of the colony. All right? The Virginian colony was established as a Protestant colony. Roman Catholicism was not tolerated. No Catholics were to settle there. Everybody who settled in Virginia had to take the oath of supremacy. That acknowledged the King of England as the head of the Protestant Church, and it just essentially made Catholics renounce their religion. And it says, other and subsequent provisions were designed to enforce this exclusion. By royal instructions issued to the governor in 1621, the colony was required, quote, to keep up the religion of the Church of England as near as may be, unquote. In addition to these instructions, the General Assembly of Virginia, the first that ever met in the United States, enacted a law providing, quote, that there be uniformity in our church as near as may be to the canons of England, both in substance and circumstance, and that all persons yield ready obedience unto them under pain of censure, unquote. So you can see this is a Protestant colony, and they're not going to tolerate Roman Catholicism. Now, this was also repeated in 1629 and 1631 before the charter to colonize Maryland had been granted to Lord Baltimore. The condition of things existing in the colony of Virginia was not at all satisfactory to the king. The first legislative assembly had met at Jamestown in 1619, each borough represented by a representative. The impulse given to popular freedom by this means excited his apprehension that the monarchical principles he desired to plant in the new world might be endangered. He manifestly feared that if the right of representation in the colonial legislature were granted to the people, it would in the end result in organizing a formidable opposition to his own authority. And being a monarchist in the strictest sense, he therefore resolved at once to bring the colonist into complete subjugation. For this purpose, he resorted to several wrongful and oppressive measures. He commanded that a number of felons unfit to remain in England should be transported to the colony, and also made the most grinding exactions upon the people in order to draw off their wealth and thereby to supply their own treasury. This is an interesting discussion. We'll continue it on the broadcast tomorrow. I hate to quit just now, but we have to.